You're not in love with them. You're in love with the person you'll become once you finally fix them. And that person doesn't exist. Never will. But you already know that, don't you? Somewhere beneath the hope, beneath the excuses, you know you're choosing this. The real question isn't why won't they change. It's why you need them broken. Stay with me. This is going to hurt. You think you're helping them. You believe your love, your patience, your unwavering presence will finally be the thing that breaks through their walls. But what if I told you that you're not trying to save them at all? What if the person you really trying to fix has been staring back at you in the mirror this entire time? Most people never realize they've been caught in this trap. They spend years pouring energy into someone who never asked to be saved, convinced that breakthrough is just one more conversation away. Psychologist Carl Jung called this projection. The parts of ourselves we can't accept, we see reflected in others and attempt to repair them there instead. The pattern always starts the same way. You meet someone who feels familiar, someone whose brokenness mirrors a wound you've carried, but never fully acknowledged within yourself. There's an immediate pull, a magnetic sense that you understand them in ways no one else can. That understanding feels like fate, like purpose, like the universe aligning to give your pain meaning. But meaning and mission are not the same thing. One liberates you. The other enslaves you to someone else's refusal to grow. Here's what they don't tell you in self-help books. The person you're trying to fix isn't confused about their behavior. They're not lost or unaware of the damage they cause. Dr. Harriet Lerner, in her research on relationship dynamics, found that most people are far more aware of their patterns than they let on. They simply lack the motivation to change them, and that's the part that destroys you slowly. Not their brokenness, but the fact that they've chosen it over and over again, even after watching you break yourself trying to save them. You keep thinking the next intervention will work, the next heartfelt letter, the next boundary you set with trembling hands, the next ultimatum delivered through tears. But they're not waiting for the right words. They're waiting for you to finally give up so they can confirm what they've believed about themselves all along, that they're unfixable. And you, without realizing it, have become a supporting actor in their self-fulfilling prophecy. Your effort is the evidence they use to prove their own hopelessness. This is the hidden trap. You think you're fighting for them, but you actually fighting against the only thing that could ever create real change, their own decision to want something different. Therapist Esther Perel has spent decades studying this dynamic. She calls it the pursuer-distancer pattern, where one person's increasing effort triggers the other's increasing withdrawal. The more you try, the less they do. Your intensity becomes their permission to stay passive. Your hope becomes the reason they don't have to generate their own. Most people don't see this until they're years deep, exhausted, wondering why they feel more like a parent than a partner, more like a therapist than a friend. The truth is uncomfortable. The person who refuses to change isn't the villain in your story. They're simply someone who has chosen their comfort zone over the terrifying work of transformation. But you've chosen their potential over your own peace. You've chosen the fantasy of who they could become over the reality of who they are right now in this moment. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking yourself the only question that matters. Why am I so afraid of walking away from someone who won't meet me halfway? Because that's the real question, isn't it? Not why won't they change, but why can't you let them stay unchanged without you? Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this in his work on addiction and attachment. He explains that we often confuse love with a compulsive need to fix what feels broken. We mistake our anxiety for devotion, our sleepless nights for loyalty, our constant vigilance for care. But none of those things are love. They're symptoms of our own unhealed wounds. The person who won't change is showing you exactly who they are. They're being honest in the only way they know how, through their consistent inaction. But you're not listening. You're too busy writing a different story in your head, one where your love is finally enough to rewrite their ending. This channel exists for people who are ready to stop writing fiction, for those willing to see the patterns they've been running from their entire lives. If you've ever found yourself in this exhausting cycle, you're not alone. And you're not here by accident. Click subscribe. This is where we stop pretending and start seeing clearly. The next layer goes deeper. But first, you need to sit with this. What if the person you were trying to save never asked for rescue because they never believed they were drowning? There's a specific moment when the pattern locks into place. You probably don't remember it because it didn't feel significant at the time. It was the first time they showed you their wound and something inside you whispered, "I can heal this. I'm different from everyone else who failed them." That whisper wasn't intuition. It was the sound of your own childhood survival mechanism activating, recognizing familiar territory, preparing to replay an old script with new actors. Psychologist Donald Winnicott identified this as the false self responding to perceived need. The version of you constructed to earn love through usefulness, through being indispensable. You learned early that your value wasn't inherent. It had to be earned, proven, demonstrated through your ability to manage other people's emotional chaos while suppressing your own. So when you met someone broken, something ancient inside you said, "Finally, a purpose that feels like home. Finally, proof that I matter because I'm needed." But need and love are not synonyms. One creates dependency, the other creates freedom. And you've been confusing the two for so long, you can't tell them apart anymore. Here's what's actually happening in your brain during these dynamics. When you engage in rescue behavior, your system releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter associated with addiction. Dr. Helen Fisher's research on love and attachment shows that the intermittent reinforcement of someone almost changing creates the same neural patterns as gambling. You get small wins, a moment of vulnerability, a promise made, a single day where they seem different, and your brain lights up like a slot machine paying out. That neurochemical reward keeps you hooked far more effectively than consistent rejection ever could, because consistent rejection you could walk away from. But hope? Hope is the perfect trap. You're not crazy for staying. You're chemically bonded to the potential of transformation, receiving just enough positive reinforcement to keep the cycle alive. The person you're trying to fix understands this dynamic even if they can't articulate it. They know exactly how much effort to give to keep you engaged. Dr. George Simon, who studies manipulative personality patterns, calls this managed perception, the art of appearing just self-aware enough to seem capable of change without actually committing to it. They'll have the breakthrough conversation at 2 in the morning. They'll cry and admit everything you've been trying to get them to see for months. And you'll feel that surge of validation, that rush of finally being heard, finally breaking through, you'll mistake their awareness for willingness. But awareness without action is just performance. It's words designed to buy time, to reset your patience clock, to give you just enough to keep investing. By morning, nothing has changed. The awareness evaporates, and you're left holding the emotional labor of that conversation alone, wondering if you imagined the whole thing. This is where the pattern becomes truly insidious, because now you have evidence that they can see the problem, which means in your mind, change is possible. You start waiting for that person who showed up at 2 in the morning to come back. You start believing that version is the real them, buried under fear. But what if that late-night version isn't the real them either? What if it's just another adaptation, another survival strategy to keep you from leaving? Psychotherapist Marcia Linehan's work on behavioral patterns shows that people do what works. If vulnerability without follow-through keeps you around, they'll keep offering vulnerability without follow-through. You're teaching them that your boundary is negotiable, that your pain has a threshold, that if they just give you enough emotional scraps, you'll stay hungry, but you'll stay. And the cruelest part? You've started measuring your own worth by their progress. When they have a good day, you feel valuable. When they backslide, you feel like a failure. Your entire sense of self has become outsourced to someone else's healing journey, a journey they never committed to taking in the first place. This is what codependency actually looks like beneath the clinical term. It's not weakness. It's not even love. It's a compulsive need to prove you're enough by making someone else whole. But you can't make anyone whole. That's not how human transformation works. People change when the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of growth. And as long as you're absorbing their consequences, managing their emotions, and buffering them from discomfort, you're removing their only motivation to change. You think you're helping, but you're actually the obstacle between them and the rock bottom that might finally create movement. Dr. Patrick Carnes, who pioneered research on trauma bonds, found that helper-helpless dynamics are among the hardest patterns to break, because helping feels righteous. It feels like love. It feels like loyalty. It feels like you're being the person you wish someone had been for you. But you're not helping them. You're helping yourself avoid the devastating truth that you can't control other people's choices, no matter how much you love them. And that loss of control terrifies you more than the exhaustion of trying. Because if you can't fix them, what does that say about your power? What does it say about all the years you've already invested? What does it say about your judgment for choosing them in the first place? These are the questions you've been running from. The ones that explain why you stay long after you should have left. If you're starting to feel something shift in your chest, something uncomfortable and true, you're exactly where you need to be. Stay with me. We're going somewhere most people refuse to look, and when you see it, you can't unsee it. You've been keeping a ledger. You might not admit it even to yourself, but somewhere in your mind there's a running tally of everything you've given. Every late-night crisis you managed, every plan you canceled, every version of yourself you made smaller so they could stay comfortable in their dysfunction. And buried beneath your exhaustion is a belief so quiet you've never spoken it aloud. Eventually, they'll see everything I've done. Eventually, they'll become someone worthy of this investment. This is what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy applied to human relationships. The irrational belief that past investment justifies future suffering. Behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman demonstrated that humans will continue losing strategies simply because they've already lost so much. Quitting feels like admitting the loss was pointless, so you stay, not because the relationship is working, but because leaving would mean accepting that all those years of effort were spent on someone who was never going to change. That acceptance feels like annihilation. It feels like your love meant nothing, like your capacity for devotion was wasted on someone incapable of receiving it. But here is the truth that will either free you or destroy you. Your love did mean something. It just meant something only to you. The person you're trying to fix never asked you to build this debt. They never signed a contract promising to become different in exchange for your patience. You created this transaction unilaterally. You decided their potential was worth your present. And now you're angry they won't honor an agreement they never made. Dr. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion reveals that helpers often have an unconscious superiority complex. The belief that their capacity to love somehow obligates others to change. You think you're being selfless, but there is a hidden arrogance in believing your love should be transformative enough to override someone else's free will, as if your care should matter more than their own agency, as if your vision for their life should supersede their choice to remain exactly as they are. This is where the resentment begins to calcify. You start noticing everything you've sacrificed with sharp, bitter clarity. The opportunities you didn't take because you were managing their crisis. The friendships that faded because you had no energy left. The version of yourself that disappeared gradually. And they're still the same. Still choosing comfort over growth. Still expecting you to regulate emotions they refuse to learn to manage themselves. You're not angry at them anymore. You're angry at yourself for believing that being needed was the same thing as being loved. Attachment researcher Sue Johnson explains that we often confuse anxious pursuit with deep connection. The adrenaline of trying to reach someone emotionally unavailable feels like passion. But it's not passion, it's activation. It's your nervous system responding to inconsistency, trying desperately to create safety in a fundamentally unsafe dynamic. Real intimacy is calm. It's consistent. It doesn't require you to perform emotional acrobatics just to receive basic respect and consideration. But calm feels boring to you now. Your system has been trained to associate love with struggle, connection with effort, devotion with suffering. So even if you left this person tomorrow, you'd find another one, someone equally unavailable. Someone whose brokenness looks just familiar enough to feel like home. Because the problem was never really them, they're just a symptom. The disease is your belief that you have to earn love through sacrifice. That belief didn't start with this relationship. It started decades ago, probably in childhood, when you learned that your needs were negotiable but everyone else's were urgent. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally volatile and you became the stabilizer. Maybe you had a sibling who required all the attention and you became invisible. Whatever the origin story, you learned early that your role was to fix, manage, absorb, and shrink. And you've been auditioning for that same role ever since. Trauma therapist Pete Walker calls this the fawn response, the survival strategy where you earn safety by becoming useful, indispensable, and endlessly accommodating to others' needs. It worked when you were a child. It kept you safe in an environment where being too much or needing too much felt dangerous. But you're not a child anymore. And the people you're trying to fix are not the parents you couldn't change. Yet your nervous system hasn't updated. It's still running the same program, still believing that if you just try hard enough, this time will be different. This time your effort will finally be enough. This time your love will be the thing that breaks the pattern. Except it won't, because the pattern isn't theirs to break, it's yours. The person who refuses to change is actually offering you a gift, though it doesn't feel like one. They're showing you exactly where you abandon yourself. Every time you override your own needs to accommodate their dysfunction, you're teaching yourself that your boundaries don't matter, that your pain isn't important enough to honor. You're training yourself in self-betrayal, and then wondering why you feel so empty, so resentful, so completely lost in a relationship where you're giving everything. Dr. Dan Siegel's work on interpersonal neurobiology shows that we cannot heal through relationships where we consistently abandon our authentic needs. True healing requires relationships where we're seen, met, and valued as we actually are, not as we perform, not as we shrink, not as we endlessly give. But you've forgotten what it feels like to be in that kind of relationship. You've forgotten that love isn't supposed to be this hard. So you've normalized the exhaustion. You've romanticized the struggle. You've convinced yourself that real love requires this level of sacrifice. And the person you're trying to fix watches all of this and learns nothing, because you've absorbed all the consequences of their choices. Why would they change when you've made it so comfortable to stay the same? You're approaching the edge of something, a truth so fundamental that once you see it, your entire relationship history will reorganize itself in your mind. But seeing it requires you to stop defending the person you've been trying to save. Are you ready for that? There was a specific conversation where everything shifted. You probably replay it sometimes when you can't sleep, analyzing what you should have said differently. They showed you who they were with perfect clarity, not through cruelty, but through honest indifference to your pain. Maybe you were crying, explaining for the 100th time how their behavior affects you. And they looked at you with something worse than anger. They looked at you with exhaustion, as if your pain was an inconvenience, as if your need for basic respect was a burden they never agreed to carry. And in that moment, something inside you made a catastrophic decision. Instead of hearing their message, you decided to speak quieter, need less, try harder. You took their inability to love you well as evidence that you were asking for too much. That's when you stopped being a partner and became a beggar. Psychologist Jonas Webb, who specializes in emotional neglect, calls this the moment of self-erasure. When you internalize someone else's limitations as proof of your own excessiveness, you started editing yourself. Not the harmful parts, but the human parts. The parts that needed reassurance, consistency, reciprocity. You told yourself you were being mature, that real love meant accepting people as they are. That compromise was the foundation of lasting relationships. But you weren't compromising. You were capitulating. Compromise requires two people meeting in the middle. You were the only one moving. And with each step toward them, you moved further from yourself. Until one day you woke up and didn't recognize the person you'd become. Someone who apologizes for having feelings. Someone who makes themselves smaller to avoid conflict. Someone who has learned to call their self-abandonment unconditional love. Dr. Alexandra Solomon, who researches relational self-awareness, found that people who compulsively fix others have often spent their entire lives abandoning themselves first. You don't stay because you're loyal. You stay because leaving would require you to acknowledge that you matter, that your needs are legitimate, that you deserve mutuality. And that acknowledgement is terrifying. Because if you matter, then every moment you accepted less than you deserved becomes a wound you inflicted on yourself. It's easier to blame them, to focus on their dysfunction, to stay distracted by the project of fixing someone else. Because if you stopped trying to fix them, you'd have to face the wreckage of your own self-concept. The years you spent proving you were worth keeping. The exhausting performance of being low maintenance while your needs screamed inside you. The constant negotiation with your own reality to make their behavior acceptable. You've been lying to yourself with such consistency that the lies feel like truth now. You call it patience when it's self-abandonment. You call it understanding when it's denial. You've constructed an entire mythology around this relationship to avoid the simplest explanation. They do and want to change because their current life works for them. They have someone who absorbs their chaos, manages their emotions, and asks for almost nothing in return. Why would they disrupt that arrangement? Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck wrote that people only change when the pain of remaining the same becomes unbearable. But you've been preventing that pain from reaching them. Every time you rescue them from consequences, you steal their opportunity for transformation. Every time you make excuses for their behavior, you confirm their worldview. You think you're being supportive, but support without accountability is enabling. And enabling isn't love, no matter how much it costs you. The person who won't change isn't damaged beyond repair. They're simply comfortable. And your presence has made their dysfunction more comfortable than growth would ever be. This is the truth that shatters everything. You're not the solution to their problems. You've become the reason they don't have to solve them. Your love isn't healing them. It's insulating them from the natural consequences that might actually create motivation for change. And somewhere deep down, you know this. That's why the resentment has started to taste like poison in your mouth. That's why you fantasize about leaving, about them finally realizing what they lost, about the dramatic moment when they beg you to come back. But that fantasy is just another version of the same pattern, still making them the center, still waiting for them to validate your worth. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research on trauma shows that we recreate familiar dynamics, not because we rebroken, but because our nervous systems seek what feels known, even when known means painful. Even when known means slowly erasing yourself for someone who isn't even paying attention to your disappearance. You've been waiting for them to notice your sacrifice, to wake up one day and see everything you've given and be transformed by gratitude. But they're never going to have that awakening, not because they're incapable of growth, but because your sacrifice has become so normal they can't even see it anymore. It's the air they breathe, the foundation they stand on, so expected that acknowledging it would require them to feel guilt they're not equipped to process. So they don't see it. And you keep giving, kept hoping that enough invisibility will eventually make you visible. You're not reading this by accident. You're here because some part of you is ready to stop performing this particular kind of self-destruction. There are people who understand this pattern from the inside, who've walked this exact path and found their way back to themselves. That's what this channel offers. Not false hope, not rescue, but the truth you've been avoiding, because it requires you to stop abandoning yourself for people who never asked you to stay. Subscribe if you're ready to stop running from that truth, because what comes next will require you to face the person you've been hiding from. The one question you've never had the courage to answer. What would happen if you loved yourself with even half the intensity you've loved them? You've been telling yourself a story about loyalty, about commitment, about being the kind of person who doesn't give up on people. But that story is a shelter you built to hide from something far more devastating, the real reason you can't leave. It's not because you love them too much. It's because leaving would require you to confront the most terrifying question you've ever faced. If you walk away from this relationship, from this identity as the person who saves broken people, who are you? Strip away the role of fixer, caretaker, emotional architect of someone else's potential, and what remains? That emptiness is what you've been running from. Existential psychologist Irvin Yalom spent decades studying this phenomenon. He called it existential avoidance through relationship fusion. You've made their dysfunction your life's work because having a mission, even an impossible one, feels safer than facing your own unlived life. Their brokenness gives you purpose. It gives you a reason to wake up, a problem to solve, a narrative where you're the hero. Without it, you'd have to face the silence of your own existence, the questions you've been postponing, the dreams you abandoned, the person you never became. Because while you were busy trying to fix them, you were hiding from the fact that your own life feels unfixed, unfinished, undefined. You don't know who you are outside of this dynamic. You've been performing the role of savior for so long that it's become your entire identity. And identity death feels like actual death. Even when the identity is killing you slowly, the fear of losing it can be more powerful than the pain of keeping it. Dr. Esther Perel has observed that some people stay in destructive relationships because the alternative, facing their own autonomous existence, triggers a primal terror. It's not romantic, it's not noble, it's a sophisticated form of hiding, using someone else's chaos as a distraction from your own emptiness. And the person you're trying to fix, they're doing the exact same thing from the other side. They stay broken because being the broken one is easier than being responsible. It's an identity that excuses them from growth, from accountability, from the terrifying work of transformation. You're both playing roles in a theater of mutual avoidance. Neither of you brave enough to step off the stage and face reality. The difference is they're honest about their choice to stay the same. You're the one pretending this is about love. But it's not about love, it's about fear. Fear of your own adequacy, fear of your own power, fear of what you might have to face if you stopped being needed. Because being needed feels like mattering. And you've confused those two things for so long that you can't imagine mattering without someone depending on you. This is the core wound. Not abandonment by them, but abandonment of yourself so long ago, you don't remember what it felt like to be whole. Developmental psychologist Alice Miller wrote that children who become caretakers learn to derive their sense of worth entirely from external validation. They never develop an internal sense of value. So they spend their lives seeking relationships where they can prove their worth through usefulness. But worth that requires constant proof isn't worth at all. It's just performance anxiety wearing the mask of love. You're exhausted because you've been performing for an audience of one who isn't even watching, who takes your performance as the baseline expectation, and still you stay. Not because leaving is impossible, but because leaving would mean admitting you've been participating in your own destruction. That every time you chose them over yourself, you were making a choice. That you had agency all along and used it to betray yourself repeatedly. That level of self-accountability is crushing. It's easier to stay and blame them for not changing than to leave and face your complicity. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment of reckoning. When you finally see your own role in the pattern, something shifts. The obsession with fixing them begins to dissolve. Not because you stop caring, but because you finally see the truth. You can't save anyone. Not because you're not enough, but because salvation isn't something one person can give another. People save themselves or they don't, and your presence or absence has far less impact on that outcome than your ego wants to believe. This realization is either devastating or liberating, depending on what you choose to do with it. You can use it to justify staying, telling yourself that since you can't help anyway, you might as well remain comfortable in the familiar dysfunction. Or you can use it to finally grant yourself permission to leave, to release them to their own journey and begin the terrifying work of living your own life. Not the life you've been performing, not the identity built on being needed, but the life that's been waiting for you beneath all that noise. The life where you matter without having to prove it, where your needs are legitimate without requiring justification, where you're enough simply by existing. That life has always been available. You've just been too afraid to claim it, because claiming it meant releasing your grip on the fantasy. The fantasy that your love could be enough to change someone, that your sacrifice could purchase their transformation, that your pain could somehow become their awakening. But pain doesn't work that way, and love isn't a transaction. And you've been operating under a false economy that's bankrupted your entire sense of self. Dr. Gabor Mate teaches that addiction isn't about the substance or behavior. It's about what you're using to avoid feeling. Your addiction is to fixing broken people, and what you're avoiding feeling is your own brokenness, your own needs, your own terrifying humanity. The person who won't change is showing you the exit. Every day they remain the same as an invitation for you to choose differently. Not to fix them harder, but to finally, devastatingly, courageously walk away and face yourself. That's the work you've been avoiding, not changing them. Changing the part of you that believes your value is conditional on someone else's transformation. This channel exists for the people ready to do that work, the ones who are tired of the performance and ready for the truth. We don't offer comfort here. We offer clarity, the kind that burns away everything false until only reality remains. If you've made it this far, you already know you're done. You just haven't admitted it yet. The question isn't whether you'll leave. It's whether you allow leave before you've sacrificed everything you are to someone who never asked for the sacrifice. Only you can answer that. But now, at least you know what you're really choosing between. Not them or loneliness, but self-abandonment or self-reclamation. Your move.